All right, so our first scripture reading is from the book of James, chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. If any of you is lacking wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to you. But ask in faith, never doubting. For the one who doubts continually is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For the consistent doubter, being double-minded and unstable in every way, must not expect to receive anything from God. Matthew 5, verse 6, one of the Beatitudes, short sayings of Jesus, he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." So last week we started a sermon series on how God speaks to us. And I shared first that there's an overall message that God speaks to us through the Judeo-Christian biblical message. And it is that there is a creator, God, use whatever name, whatever image, whatever metaphor works best for you, source, creator, big love, higher power, doesn't matter. But there is a creator who has created every one of us, every human on the planet and all that exists, and every one of us is God's beloved child, and God cherishes and adores and loves every one of us, and every day is trying to get through to us, to communicate with us in an ongoing way. That's the overall message. In fact, if somebody said, "What's your church believe?" Learn Micah 6:8 and learn that, and that's a pretty good summary. And then I went on last week to say that once we start to really communicate with God and get down into that intentionally and hear God's voice and long to hear God's voice and experience God's presence, then there will most likely often be another voice or another influence that will rise up, often most powerfully just within we ourselves, and try to talk us out of it. We might refer to it as an inner opponent. We'll come back to this later in the series. And then I encourage you to use this tool. Notice what you notice. Be consciously awake and aware of your thoughts and your feelings. Don't just have them. Don't just be driven by them. Be aware of them. As they say in 12-step programs, pause, pray, and then proceed. Learn to be in touch with what you're noticing. Don't just be on autopilot. God is speaking, but we need to learn to tune in. It's almost like a radio frequency that we need to tune into. Get past the static. Now, before we go any further in this series, I realize that there's something else foundationally that I've been wanting to share with you ever since I got here. It's another tool of sorts for understanding ourselves spiritually, kind of like the Enneagram. If you don't know what the Enneagram is, don't worry. As Richard Rohr says, there is salvation without it, but he's not completely sure, you know. But no, it's a personality typology that helps us understand ourselves, self-awareness. This is another similar tool of sorts, and it's referred to as the 4 spiritual types. So before we go any further, I want to share with you the 4 spiritual types that come to us through a book written by a woman named Corinne Ware, who used to work with the Alban Institute. It's kind of a think tank for church growth. It came out initially in 1995. It's kind of become a classic among clergy and church folks because there's just so much simple wisdom here. So Corinne Ware says that there are 4 basic spiritual types, 4 different ways in which people are wired just as part of who we are. And there's no one that's better than the other, just like the Enneagram. All 9 types are equally, they're on a circle. There's no one that's better. They all have their strengths and their weaknesses, their beauty and their pitfalls. Same with the spiritual types. So there's 4 of them in no particular order. But some people will lean very heavily to just one, And it's really helpful to understand who we are, because God is going to speak to us primarily through who we are and how we show up in life. We bring our own beings and our own lenses to this whole conversation with God that I'm trying to help us go deeper into. So here's the first one. The first is the head type. Now, if you're a head spiritual type, then your primary way of experiencing God is through good intellectual substance, content, ideas that stimulate and challenge and stretch your mind. When that happens, a head type person is like, now you're talking my language. This has some meat. You feel alive. Head types are often drawn to doctrine and dogma, even if just to argue with it. And they love, the Greek meanings of words and Hebrew stuff. Anything that would, of course, require an extended advanced educational degree in order to ascertain. They tend to like a good traditional hymn with words that talk about God's immortal, ineffable attributes. And they tend to be suspicious of too much touchy-feely stuff, which leads to the next type. The second type is the heart type. The heart type wants and needs to feel God's presence and not to have to think about it too much. Tell me a story that's going to make me cry. Heart types need to feel God emotionally. They want to be moved spiritually. Don't bore me with too many ideas. Don't complicate this for me. They tend to like worship songs that will bring them to tears and help them feel God's presence, and they don't want too much structure or rote prayers or high church liturgy. Don't make me memorize these things. That just, rote memorization. I want it extemporaneous from the heart. That's a heart type. The third type is the mystic type. Now, I already see some of you staring at each other like, giving each other the elbows. So we're only halfway through. Right? The mystics prefer a mysterious experience of the divine presence that is not just an emotion. Very often, the mystic type is a head person who, almost against their will or their predisposition, experiences the divine presence in a way that they can't explain away or deny, and that they have to deal with whether they like it or not. And very often, initially, they don't like it. It's like an interruption. They thought they had this religion thing figured out. It's the physicist who was an atheist, secular materialist, who then has a mystical experience of divine presence that blows all the categories open, and then they don't know what to do with. Mystics have visions that they're almost embarrassed about because it sounds too woo-woo for them. They don't tend to be woo-woo people. They have dreams that they can't let go of. They don't know what to do with. Out of nowhere, they hear an inner voice. They often wonder if they need therapy or if they're losing their mind. They tend to like the smells and bells of higher church liturgy and Gothic chants and massive cathedrals or the silence of a redwood forest. They often aren't sure where they fit. And they're almost embarrassed that despite their suspicions, God keeps showing up in strange coincidences and serendipities and synchronicities that defy rational explanation. And it's a hard spiritual life because they long for more, and they know you can't make an authentic mystical experience happen. All you can do is believe that they do because you had one, and stay open. And the fourth type is the social justice type. And as the label would suggest, they experience God when they're taking action to right the wrongs of the world. The UCC, our denomination, the United Church of Christ, this congregation's denomination, draws a lot of social justice types because of our wonderful history of being active and inclusive with regard to social justice issues. There was an old UCC bumper sticker that I used to love. It said, Shakespeare, to be or not to be. The UCC, to be is to do. Sinatra, doobie doobie doo. Social justice types tend to have an allergy to God talk and Bible study and warm, fuzzy spirituality that doesn't lead to actions to make the world a better place. Most churches are not radical enough for social justice types. In fact, they often have been so turned off by the way spirituality has been presented to them that they convince themselves that the God stuff really isn't for them. They kind of tolerate it because they believe in the power of community. But don't ask them to lead a prayer. The rest of you can talk about God. Let me know when we're meeting for the protest and I'll make the signs. But when a social justice type connects with the presence and the leading of the power of the Spirit, then they wind up leading grounded, soulful movements for justice that change the world. And as for music, they want songs about justice. And they want worship to be recharging for social change and a fresh set of marching orders for engaging the world beyond the church. Okay. Now, we're not going to get that much farther today than this, but this is important foundational stuff. But I want to strongly encourage you to give some thought as to what kind of spiritual type you are. Not to put yourself in a box, but to better understand yourself spiritually. As I said, no one is better than others, and many of us have aspects of all four in us. And as a church, we've got all four here. Makes preaching kind of challenging sometimes. But I think about this stuff. How's such and such a type going to hear this? For you to experience God's voice and presence in your life, it helps to know how you are wired. Because that's the primary way and place in which God is likely to connect with you. God knows you. So just two more very simple points today, and actually they're questions, and then I'll close with a story. The first question: have you decided yet that God is real? Questions and doubts about God and your faith are not only important, they are essential. We welcome questions here. We love good questions here. They usually are our greatest teachers. A good, honest question, even if it's perplexing or frightening or unanswerable, ultimately, is a gift from God given to you to lead you into deeper truth. And this is why when someone says, some of the stuff you're talking about is confusing me, you're sort of blowing apart the faith that I showed up here with, and I kind of like it, but I'm kind of, I don't know what to think anymore. I say, oh, that's great. That's great. God can really speak to you now. But if you spend your life on the theological debating team, in a never-ending intellectual sparring match with your own soul, chances are, as James put it, you can't expect too much from God. Because you're not really open to it. A lot of us would rather ask never-ending questions than receive responses that challenge us to a deeper commitment or action. It's a safe place to be. If you can't be sure, you can't make a commitment. Some of us do that without even realizing we're doing it. I did. I talked myself into a good faith crisis at the end of college, primarily because I wanted to have some fun and not be bothered with all these commitments that I was making as a Christian. So that's the question. I could say more about it. I'm going to skip it. Second question. Oh, one more thing. At some point, you're going to have to make a decision. You know, you're never going to prove the existence of God beyond a shadow of a doubt. I tried. Hard. You're never going to prove it. At some point, you say, you know what? I'm done questioning it. And faith means I'm going to live my life as if I know God is real. And all I can say is that's when the miracles start to happen. And it's an intellectual scandal. It's circular logic, but believing is seeing. Not the other way around. So at some point, give up questioning if this is real and start living as though it is. And then some amazing things will happen. All right, second question. Do you want God to speak to you? Seemed like a duh question, right? But this is why I read that beatitude. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for God. For they will be satisfied. They will be filled. This is not a casual thing. If God is going to speak to you in this ongoing, life-directing, life-changing, beautiful way that I'm suggesting in this series, you got to want it. Because God will never do it to you against your will. If we humans have any power, real power that's ours, it is the freedom to choose. God will not force God's self upon you. But God will outweigh you. I mean, when you're ready, God will be there. All right. So here's the story. And it's just an illustration of how someone heard God speak in a way that changed her life and someone else's life. I actually turned this into a song. It's called If There Really Is a God. I'm not going to sing it for you. I'm just going to tell you the story. But there was a woman named Michelle. That's her real name. I know her. It's a true story. She and her husband were committed followers of Christ, and they decided to start a daycare business. And they really wanted it to be a ministry because there were a lot of single parents in their area with lower income stuff and who needed health care, daycare. And word got around that they would use a sliding scale financially and that they were kind of flexible if you were up against it financially. And sure enough, quite a few people kind of took advantage of it. There was one woman named Suzanne who had 2 kids, and she would drop them off, and she paid a little bit at first, but then just stopped paying altogether. And it went on for a while, and Michelle and her husband, they're trying to run a business. Their friends would all say, you can't run a business this way. You're going to go under if you keep doing this. And they would say, yeah, well, it's not just a business. This is our ministry, and we trust God. Suzanne all of a sudden disappeared without paying her bill. It was hard. Kind of resented it. Not long after that, Michelle was praying one night, and while she's praying, this thought popped into her mind. Notice what you notice. The thought said, take Suzanne some groceries. And at first she fought it. She's like, yeah, that's absurd. But the thought kept coming, so finally she said, all right. So she goes grocery shopping. She gets 2 nice big bags of groceries, goes to Suzanne's house. She knew where she lived, knocks on the door. No one was home. She said, all right, just dropped them on the porch, left, didn't leave a note, nothing. But Okay, God, I did my part. About a year later, she's driving a couple of towns away, and she sees some kids playing in this front yard, and that's Suzanne's kids. And at first she was just going to drive, she was kind of mad. And she said, nah, I'm going with Einstein that coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. So she pulls the car over and she sees the kids, and they see her and they recognize her and they give her a big hug and they say, hey, this is our house now, come and meet, And so they took her to the house. Suzanne was standing at the door and she sees Michelle and she says, Michelle, you're not going to believe this. I just wrote out a check for you. I know I owe you some money. I'm so sorry I just disappeared. She said, would you come in? I'd like to explain what happened. And so Michelle said, sure. She said, this is embarrassing and hard for me to talk about, but I want you to know I was in a really toxic marriage. And I didn't know what to do. And things got so bad. Trust me, I'm lucky to be alive. Things got so bad, though, that I didn't want to be alive. And I got a gun, and I was going to kill myself and take my kids with me. And she said, I was desperate, and we didn't have any money, and we were going to get evicted, and my kids were hungry. And I'm in the car driving home one day, and I cried out to God. I said, God, if you're even there, I need to know now. And she said, I pull in the driveway, and you're not going to believe this, but on my porch, there's 2 bags of groceries. She said, it was like God answered my prayer. And so there was this church down the road that I'd driven by a million times. I called them up and I told them my situation, and they rallied around me and they took me in, and my husband got dealt with and he's in jail now, and I got a job and we're doing so much better, and God is in my life in a way I never dreamed. And she just said, thanks for being patient with me, Michelle. Michelle never told her who dropped the groceries by. And the real miracle in the story is that she noticed that thought when she was praying and risked believing God was speaking to her and acted on it. How many miracles do we miss because we're not paying attention, or we're not willing to do something that's silly? Food for thought. Let's all get a little weirder, okay? Amen.